Imagine a moment when the whole world seems to hold its breath. A phone rings in a thickly carpeted room in the capital, and just minutes into the call, the air turns so heavy that a head of state, in a fit of fury, slams the receiver down onto a hardwood desk. The sharp, dry sound doesn't stay confined within four walls. It echoes like a warning, a signal of the storm about to sweep across the globe. A scene that feels straight out of a movie, but it actually happened, setting off a chain reaction that spread from Washington to Beijing and then pulled major and minor capitals alike into its vortex. The cause wasn't a nuclear test nor a border clash. It all stemmed from a cold, clear-cut statement broadcast live on international television. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stared directly into the camera, his voice firm and unwavering. Any country buying Russian oil through China as an intermediary would immediately face a 100% tariff. No metaphors, no ambiguity. It was an ultimatum. In that moment, the world split in two. Washington's declaration wasn't just aimed at Beijing, it was a challenge to the entire international community. Every ally, every partner, from India to Germany, from Japan to Brazil, suddenly found themselves confronting a painful question: whose side are you on? And in every tense glance exchanged behind closed doors, it became clear. This was no longer just a trade dispute. It was a critical test of trust and national interest. To truly grasp the drama behind that explosive phone call, we have to zoom out to see the bigger picture. For over a year, Washington had been tightening the screws on Moscow with increasingly severe sanctions, all aimed at one goal: choking off the financial lifeline feeding Russia's war machine. But on the global energy chessboard, an unexpected player emerged as Moscow's lifeline: Beijing. And from that point on, the global oil crisis began to erupt. For over a year, Washington had been steadily tightening its economic stranglehold on Moscow. One wave of sanctions after another was rolled out, targeting Russia's energy sector, the financial lifeblood of its war machine. Countless oil companies, banks, and shipping conglomerates were blacklisted. European ports, once bustling with Russian oil tankers, fell eerily silent, almost abandoned. The US and its allies believed that by cutting off Russia's key revenue stream, Moscow would eventually weaken and be forced to retreat. But just then, a lifeline appeared, and it bore the name China. Beijing not only quietly continued to import Russian oil, it openly signed record-breaking deals. Over 2.2 million barrels of Russian crude arrived at Chinese ports each day, a 16% increase from the year before. For China's leadership, it was simply legal business, a sovereign right to secure energy. Their argument: no international law prohibits buying oil from a country at war. But from Washington's perspective, every one of those barrels was no different from a bullet fueling the conflict, a betrayal of the effort to isolate Moscow. Tensions escalated as core principles clashed head-on: free trade versus sanctions, national sovereignty entangled with political pressure, economic interests tangled up with moral responsibility. Analysts described it as a global oil matrix, one that no nation could escape. From Tokyo to Berlin, from New Delhi to Riyadh, every government was forced to calculate its every move, because the price of oil wasn't just a market figure, it was the heartbeat of the economy and the foundation of social stability. In that landscape, Washington's patience began to wear thin. Diplomatic advice and warnings seemed to lose their impact. A flurry of official visits and emergency summits yielded only vague promises, while Russian oil continued to flow quietly into Asia. For the White House, patience had begun to look like weakness, and so rather than keep circling the issue, Washington decided to unleash a warning unlike any before. One afternoon, as international news screens suddenly lit up, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent appeared. His eyes were cold as steel, his voice unwavering. He spoke no longer of advice or requests. Everything was distilled into two words: ultimatum. Bessent declared that any nation buying Russian oil through Chinese intermediaries would immediately be hit with a 100% U.S. tariff. His words struck like lightning from a clear sky, stunning the world. And from that moment on, the board was reset. There was no turning back. Washington had officially entered the game of full-scale tariff warfare. Washington's ultimatum hit like an explosion in the silence, shaking the very foundation of global trade. Scott Bessent left no room for ambiguity. He made it clear, not only would those who directly purchased Russian oil be penalized, But any energy flow involving China would face a 100% tariff. That meant from Europe to Asia, any nation continuing to rely on Beijing as a middleman for cheap oil had better prepare to pay a steep price. In Berlin, policymakers instantly felt the pressure. Germany exports over $130 billion worth of goods to the US every year, a lifeline for its auto and machinery industries. If Washington truly enforced punitive tariffs, the entire German economic engine could shake. In New Delhi, the equation was even trickier. India needs cheap Russian oil to sustain its growth, but also depends on the US to counterbalance China's regional power. One misstep, and both its economic and strategic balance could collapse. Even Japan and South Korea, close allies of Washington, weren't in an easy position. They are deeply intertwined with Chinese supply chains, from electronic components to rare materials. If forced to cut ties to avoid American tariffs, they themselves would suffer the heaviest blow. From Paris and Brussels to Ottawa, phones rang off the hook and emergency meetings lit up the night. The debate was no longer about right or wrong, it was a frantic race to dodge or minimize the fallout. What worried many wasn't just the policy, it was Washington's tone. It didn't feel like an invitation to unite, it sounded like a verdict. Besant's message was blunt: stand with us or pay the price. To many European observers, this was nothing short of economic blackmail. And yet, in the eyes of the White House, it was a necessary move, a hardline tactic to force wavering allies off the fence between profit and principle. But on the strategic chessboard, every aggressive move carries risk. By swinging the tariff hammer, Washington wasn't just hitting Beijing, it was unintentionally cornering its own allies, making them feel coerced. And in that moment of high-stakes tension, the world turned to China, waiting to see how Beijing would respond. The answer came faster than anyone expected. Less than 8 hours after Besant delivered his ultimatum, Beijing struck back. Not with fiery rhetoric, not with a broadcasted counterstatement, but with a move so unexpected it stunned the globe. High in the Tibetan mountains, massive hydroelectric dams suddenly roared to life. Hundreds of turbines spun at full force, releasing an enormous surge of electricity, a silent yet thunderous signal. It was a geoelectric counterstrike, a response made with renewable power. And it turned an already tangled geopolitical standoff into something even more dramatic. Just hours after Washington issued its ultimatum, Beijing delivered its response. But what shocked the world wasn't just the speed, it was the method. Not a fiery press conference, not the usual diplomatic war of words. Instead, China responded with a symbolic act, a carefully choreographed political performance powered by energy. High in the towering mountains of Tibet, 5 massive hydroelectric dams, long operating at minimal capacity, suddenly roared to life. The thunder of cascading water echoed through the valleys as hundreds of colossal turbines spun furiously, unleashing hundreds of millions of megawatt-hours of electricity, a figure so staggering it dwarfed the annual output of the famed Three Gorges Dam, already considered an engineering marvel. The world quickly realized Beijing wasn't just generating electricity, it was sending a message, a declaration written in light, carried through every transmission tower, every factory, every energy-hungry industrial zone. And the message was crystal clear: if you want to weaponize oil, we can weaponize renewable energy. Many analysts believe this was a move long in the making. For years, Beijing had quietly poured hundreds of billions of dollars into hydro, solar, wind, and nuclear power. And now, it only needed the right moment to turn that investment into political leverage. The geoelectric counterstrike, as Western media dubbed it, was nothing short of a power display, literally. America struck with oil, China struck back with electricity. A bold shift that challenged the very way the world thinks about energy in geopolitics. From Brussels to New Delhi, real-time updates left leaders reeling. If Washington could shake the world with tariff threats, then Beijing offered a different vision. A colossal economy no longer dependent on imported oil, but slowly becoming self-sufficient through cheap, clean, and abundant power. That image served as a sharp reminder. While America remained tethered to oil, China had been laying the foundation for a new energy century. But the tremor wasn't just technological, it was political. Beijing's move immediately pushed many of Washington's allies into a corner. Questions began to surface. Can we bet our entire future on the US while China proves it can stand on its own? And behind closed doors, more than a few leaders quietly admitted a hard truth. Following Washington's hardline policy might mean locking themselves into a cycle of conflict, while staying neutral or engaging with Beijing might offer a safer, more pragmatic path. From that moment on, the chessboard began to shift. Washington had believed its ultimatum would force the world to choose sides, but Beijing's electric counterstrike turned that decision into a far more complicated equation. And so, a new dilemma emerged. A strategic trap that every American ally from Germany to India, from Japan to South Korea now had to confront. Washington's allies had never felt so cornered. The US ultimatum, coupled with China's dramatic energy show of force, left them trapped between two powers, and both choices carried unpredictable costs. In Europe, especially Germany, the pressure was crushing. Germany exports over $130 billion worth of goods to the US each year, from cars and machinery to pharmaceuticals. If Washington truly raised tariff walls, assembly lines in Stuttgart and Munich could grind to a halt, putting tens of thousands of workers in jeopardy. But if Germany cut off access to cheap energy, it risked reliving the nightmare of the last freezing winter, a heating crisis that brought the nation to its knees. India, meanwhile, found itself walking a tightrope. New Delhi knew cheap Russian oil was essential to sustaining its blistering growth and shielding hundreds of millions from the spiral of inflation. At the same time, its strategic partnership with Washington was a vital shield against China's growing assertiveness along the Himalayan border. Remove either pillar, and the balance of a nation with 1.4 billion people could tip, with consequences rippling from Wall Street to the poorest alleys of Kolkata. Japan and South Korea were no less conflicted. Though firmly aligned with the US militarily, both nations were deeply enmeshed in Chinese supply chains. Millions of electric cars, smartphones, and semiconductors relied on components stamped "Made in China." Choosing Washington outright could cost them not only economically, but socially. Leaders in Tokyo and Seoul knew a sudden tariff shock could ignite public unrest, a scenario they were desperate to avoid. That's why many European newspapers didn't hesitate to call Besant's strategy what it felt like: economic blackmail. Washington believed that only maximum pressure could snap its allies out of hesitation, but in doing so, it may have pushed them to consider alternative exits. Behind closed doors, in urgent meetings, voices began to rise. We cannot let Washington dictate our fate. And slowly, from Paris to New Delhi, from Tokyo to Ottawa, a new line of thinking emerged. Is there a way to chart a middle path, one that preserves ties with the US while avoiding open confrontation with China? As those questions echoed across boardrooms and cabinet meetings, the world turned its eyes once again to Beijing, a place long known for its deft, calculated trade maneuvers. China never waits to be cornered before it adapts. It had already laid the groundwork for evasive workarounds long before the noose tightened. And now, as Washington clamped down, Beijing had even more reason to turn those backdoor tactics into frontline weapons. While Washington was busy erecting tariff walls, Beijing appeared calm, almost as if it already held a map of every possible detour. China has long been considered a master in the art of bypassing sanctions, and once again, it proved just that. In reality, nearly 70% of products labeled "Made in China" bound for the US were already being rerouted through third countries. A smartphone assembled in Shenzhen could be repackaged in Hanoi and suddenly bear the label "Made in Vietnam." A shipment of electronic components passed through Monterrey, Mexico, and with a local stamp of origin slipped through US customs undetected. Some cargo ships even departed straight from Shanghai but made brief stops in Vancouver, enough to have their paperwork rewritten, reclassifying the goods as Canadian. Behind these clever workarounds lies a vast and intricate network, a web of companies, local governments, and third-party intermediaries. Beijing knows the global game by heart. If you can't confront an attack head-on, find the loopholes and turn your opponent's offensive into a subtle counterstrike. And the irony? These escape hatches put the US in an even tougher position. Because to truly shut them down, Washington would have to slap across-the-board tariffs not just on China, but also on longtime partners like Vietnam, Mexico, and Canada. This is exactly the scenario Washington dreads most. aiming at China only to inadvertently hurt the very network of friends it relies on. If these nations begin to feel dragged into a sanctions war they never signed up for, resentment will start to simmer. The alliances that the US has painstakingly built could quickly turn from assets into liabilities, even sources of fracture. And as Washington swings its tariff hammer ever harder, one question is beginning to echo across the American heartland. Are these blows really landing on our rival, or are they coming back to hit us in the face? Because history has shown in every trade war the US has fought, the first to feel the pain have always been its own consumers, its own businesses, and its own economy. Tariffs, they sound like a weapon aimed squarely at the enemy, but in truth, they're more like a double-edged sword. Every time Washington raises tariffs to 20%, 30%, even 50%, the first to feel the weight isn't Beijing, it's American businesses and consumers. Picture a middle-class family in Texas just trying to buy a new phone for their kid going back to school, only to find it costs hundreds more because its components were hit with import duties. A farmer in Iowa wants to buy new machinery, but the price has jumped by half. Slowly but surely, each punitive tax bleeds into everyday bills: groceries, gas, electricity, school supplies. Recent history makes this painfully clear. In past trade wars, billions in tariffs were slapped on Chinese goods, but that money didn't vanish. It simply shifted, landing squarely on the shoulders of American households. Inflation climbed, businesses cut jobs, and fear of recession crept into homes across the country. Experts call this the reverse tax, a policy meant to punish a rival, but ends up taxing your own people instead. And the harder Washington swings the tariff hammer, the louder the outcry at home. On the streets of Chicago or Los Angeles, few care about the nuances of geopolitics. What they see is their wallet shrinking. At the checkout line, at the gas pump, when the utility bill arrives. That frustration, left to build, can swell into a wave of political backlash, something no administration in Washington can afford to ignore. This is the bitter paradox of tariff wars. The weapon is drawn to wound the opponent, but too often the blade slices the hand that wields it. Meanwhile, as America grapples with the domestic fallout, the world keeps spinning, adapting to new rules. The global chessboard of energy and trade, from oil to hydroelectric power, from supply chains to investment flows, is shifting into a new order, one where every move carries risk and every strategy holds the potential for unexpected consequences. This confrontation at its core is no longer just about oil or tariffs. It's reshaping the entire global chessboard of energy and trade. The US is trying to turn Russian oil into a form of forbidden contraband, using economic pressure as a weapon to force nations into choosing sides. Meanwhile, China has shown it's prepared with an alternative path, an ecosystem of renewable energy and intricate workarounds strong enough to endure the storm and possibly flip the board in its favor. Washington's allies are caught in a tightening vortex, where every choice carries risks and long-term consequences. What we're witnessing is a new kind of energy world war, one with no safe borders, no nation truly immune. The question that remains, can Washington truly force the world into one camp? Or will its pressure campaign instead spark the birth of a new counter-alliance with Beijing at the center? Ladies and gentlemen, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you were a world leader, which path would you choose? And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay with us as we uncover more high-stakes stories from the global chessboard.